Welcome to Allies or Enemies. I'm Jess.
And I am Sean, and today we are talking about Tag Team, and our copy was provided for review, but the thoughts in this video are all our own.
Tag Team is designed by Gricha, Germain, and Corentin Lebrat, and it is a head-to-head two-player card game that combines deck building and auto battling with a cast of 12 characters. Let's take a look at how it plays.
At the start of the game, each player chooses 2 fighters and takes their fighter boards along with a health tracker, power cubes, any tokens, and their respective deck of cards, which get shuffled together to make one deck, except for their starter cards, which will be the first 2 cards that get played. On your first turn, you'll put your 2 starter cards in whatever order you like, and then both players will flip their cards one by one and take whatever action is on that card, resolving that action against whatever fighter is on their opponent's card. These might be things like attacking to decrease their opponent's health, usually based on fighter power, building up power, which will help future attacks, defending, which often leads to some kind of benefit if played against an attack, healing to regain health, or a wide range of special abilities. Once all of the cards in your pile have been played, you draw 3 more cards from your deck and choose 1 to add to your current pile, adding it anywhere in the stack, but importantly, keeping the current cards in the same order. Then you put your pile back down and flip through and resolve again. The game continues like this until one character is KO'd, or one of the unique win conditions is met, and then the winning tag team is named.
So that was the overview of how to play. And the interesting thing really is that you have these 2 characters that you are working with, and they each have their own decks, and they're all quite different, but you're combining those cards into one deck. And so you really have to think about what cards you want to add, because there's a lot you're considering. You are considering what cards your opponent's playing, but you're also considering that whichever card gets revealed is going to be the active character. And as a result, they're going to be the target for the attacks that might be happening.
Yeah, and that really is the game, is trying to read what your opponent's doing, because you already, after that first round, you know the 2 cards, you know the order of those 2 cards. And the order between them isn't going to change, but every time they add a new card, they can add that anywhere, to the top, to the bottom, in between those. And so it's kind of like a cat and mouse. You're trying to read them. There's no other game that we do as much under the table figuring out, but you got to make sure to keep the other ones in order as well. But yeah, that is such a big part, is trying to read that, because there's so many cards that are like, specifically you want to play a defense card when they're trying to attack, or you want to play this sort of reaction or whatever it is to mess with that. So you're really trying to read your opponent.
Yeah, that is definitely a core part, and it can feel really good if you get that right, because you do have things like shield cards, and if you can manage to block an attack, you often also get an additional bonus. But then your opponent knows now you have a shield card, so they're going to try and counter that, but they don't quite know what you're doing either. So it just ends up being this interesting dynamic where you're obviously trying to inflict the damage that you need to, whilst also defending when you need to.
And a big part of this game as well is it's not quite like different classes, but kind of that you've got like defendy characters, you've got attacky characters. So it's a little bit like if anyone plays Overwatch or, I don't know, I'm only really familiar with Overwatch, but I know that there's those big MOBA games. I feel so old saying that. But any of those sorts of games where you have those different classes, it's a little bit like that, where you've got kind of a tank, kind of a healer, kind of an attacker. They're not quite as easy to kind of shoehorn into those groups though. Like there is a lot of it is a little bit blurry, but you definitely do have those. And I think an interesting part of this game is when you're making your tag team is trying to kind of balance that as well.
Yeah, and you do really want to try and find the synergies between the characters. But all of the decks, I think, really do acknowledge that you do have a partner because there'll be cards that will heal your partner, there'll be cards that will give your partner power, and then sometimes the two characters may work really well together in surprising ways. Like maybe you'll have two characters that are just like really strong attackers and can like destroy your opponent, or other times that they have such high defense, it's hard to damage either one of them. So it may not necessarily be like that tag team that one is strong in one area and one's weak in another. And it's just about figuring out the combo that you're playing with.
And a lot of it obviously is also just dealing with the cards that you've got as well, because every turn you're choosing between 3 cards and sometimes you're only picking from one of the 2 characters. So sometimes you don't have all the choice that you might like, but you're just playing with that hand that you're dealt. But let's actually talk about some of those specific characters. So I'm going to, at super speed, tell you about all 12 of the characters. So first up, there is Joan. She's got a whole bunch of defense and shield cards. Then there's the Wild Bunch. That's 5 different cowboys that are in one group. So every time you hit them, it only moves 1 space down their health track, but their health track's only 5 long. Then there's Bodvar the Berserker. He has a bit of a slow build-up, but once he builds up, he turns into a bear, and then he's super dangerous. Then there's Shango. He's trying to put these fire tokens on one character. If he gets 5 on one character, he just wins the game. There's Maman Brigitte. She's really hard to kill because she's got 2 KO spaces, but if you don't hit them exactly, you miss them and she comes back to life. There's Mephisto, and he's got a token that flips over where he builds up energy pretty quickly, or he attacks you with that energy. There's the Fey Folk. That's 3 different characters. You've got to knock out all of them and then have this one specific card come up in order to defeat them. Mordred, who's kind of the like baseline character, but has a lot of strong attacks. Milady, who's got a whole bunch of these randomized tokens, and they do all different kinds of stuff. There's the Golem, who's got a ton of defense and gives defense to his teammate. There's Wang Fei Hung, who uses his opponent's power against them. And there's Qing Shi, who runs this armada of ships, and she's got a track that she slowly builds up that's going to change how powerful her cards are.
So there are a ton of characters who all work in really different ways. And I like that, for example, for Shango, you're trying to get the fire tokens on a specific opponent. So you really want to try and make sure anytime your card comes out that puts out a fire token, that your opponent is also playing that character card.
Yeah, and Jess really does like using him, and it changes the game quite a bit because that becomes the whole thing. It's just thinking about, I really don't want to line up with that, because as soon as you've switched, so as soon as you manage to put out a different character, he's got to restart from the start again. So he can definitely, I think you've beat me in 5 turns before, where just everything's gone on the one character. I haven't guessed right, and I've just gotten screwed over. But as soon as you can shift it, all of a sudden you bought a ton of time.
Yeah, so it definitely makes the game feel a little bit different. I like that for Gollum, who has a whole bunch of defense. I think I get a little bit cocky with how much defense he has, because he's able to give a token to protect your opponent, but he also takes damage when you do that. And so it's a bit risky because like every time you're doing it, you're getting more and more hurt.
Yeah, but you can really like team them up nicely too, because with the Golem, for example, he's protecting the other one and taking damage. But if your other person can also heal, you can maybe build it so that you just have like a ton of defense between the 2 of them. And there's a few like that as well. There's like the Wild Bunch, the Cowboys, because you have to stop every time you hit them. So it doesn't matter if you hit them for 6, they're still only going to move down 1 thing. But you only need to hit them 5 times and then they lose. So you really need to team them up with someone who can heal a lot, because then you can just kind of keep bringing them back to life and they become really hard to kill.
Yeah, and it's interesting with the health bars because those come in different amounts, but there's also the Fey Folk where there are 3 health bars. So they can die twice before it starts getting dangerous, and they could even die a 3rd time because you only lose once their starting card comes up. And if you're really lucky, you may even be able to just win because there is a card in someone's deck that gets rid of one of your opponent's cards. So if that comes up on your Fey Folk starting card, then there's no way that you can lose.
Yeah, you can just become eternal because they played the other card. I think there's actually a few cards that can do that. And there's cards that cancel cards, so then they just stay alive as well. There's lots of interesting ways and like surprising ways that these cards interact with each other. There's also some of the really attacky ones are fun as well. The ones like Mephisto, who is just kind of building up all the time. Every single time he hits you, it's like a little bit harder. Or Mordred, who has some like really big hit cards. But Mephisto's also got this one that I love. That is, if I would lose the game, I actually win the game. And I've never pulled that off, but it kind of feels like a mermaid win, like from Sea Salt and Paper. And I love those when you've got like just those big kind of Hail Mary wins that you can do in a game.
So in terms of components, this is a card game. So cards are obviously like the main component. And I'd say they're probably about medium quality. They're not like top tier linen finish, but they're not bottom tier either. There are also these player mats that clearly like show the health bars of everybody. There's also these player cards, and we use those as dividers, but you could also use those to randomize your characters that you want to be.
And there's also a whole bunch of tokens. Those all do a decent job. There's these little cubes that are the power cubes, and those are kind of, if you own 12 board games, you probably have cubes that look like this. And there's little wooden ones, little wooden tokens as well, that are both your health markers and these other special markers.
And then there's also 2 rule books, and I really like that there are 2 separate rule books. There's one for the general gameplay, and then there's one just for all the individual fighters. And that gives a really good overview of the fighters. And it also includes an FAQ, which you probably like don't need to memorize, but it covers those like specific situations when a card, you can't quite figure out the order of a card.
Yeah, and it really covers everything. We've played this probably 12 times. We haven't come into an instance yet where we've needed to check out BGG or look elsewhere to try and figure out an answer. Everything has been in that rule book, and it's pretty solid how that's laid out too, because before each game, you just quickly look at the 2 characters that you're being. You can even, for most of the characters, really, you could skip that and you'd figure it out just from their cards. But there are a few where that is really helpful. Characters like Milady and Shango, I think, maybe have some stuff that maybe you weren't going to figure out if you didn't look at that, but you're going to figure it out pretty quick. And once you've played with everyone once, you're going to know how to use them.
Yeah, and I think something that does help you figure it out pretty quick is that the cards have both like an icon and text as well. So you don't have to be too familiar with a whole bunch of icons because you can just read about it. The other thing the cards have and the player mats is the artwork. And I think the artwork is really cool, creating this whole like cast of interesting characters.
Yeah, and I think that's really one of the selling points of the game. But the art in this is terrific. And it's the same artist who did Tokaido, and that's kind of one of the most beautiful games that there is. And it's got this really cool style that is kind of like a comic booky, kind of video game-ish thing, where it really feels like all of these characters have more going on outside of these cards. And it really does kind of bring me into this universe. And that's, I think, one of my big selling points for the game. But I did want to cover that in final thoughts. So let's just roll into that. So like I was just saying, one of the biggest selling points for me for this game is that cast of characters and that kind of universe, because I'm a huge fan of games like Street Fighter or Overwatch or really anything where there's a whole bunch of different characters that I can try out, and there's just this kind of like undercurrent of lore, even if they don't do a lot with that. I just love kind of thinking about that shared universe.
Yeah, it is really fun to have characters that look so different and that play so different. And I think there are quite a few like head-to-head card games, but I think this does bring something a bit different by always having two characters that you're playing. It does remind me of a couple games, and one of those games is Wizard's Cup, because that's another auto battler. But in Wizard's Cup, you're each using the same deck of cards that you start with. And so this feels quite a bit different with the different characters.
Another one that this does remind me of is Dungeon Mayhem, which is, I think, kind of one of the first ones everyone thinks of when you think of a head-to-head card game. It's at least one of the first ones I think of, but this one definitely has a lot more depth than that, and the characters do feel a little bit more different. That's not a slam on Dungeon Mayhem, but I think there is a bit more to this.
Yeah, I'd say the characters definitely do feel more different, but along with the characters feeling a bit different, that does mean that every time you play, you do have to learn new character rules. So if you're someone who doesn't really like learning a lot of rules, just bear that in mind. But I think really, if you play with each character twice, you've kind of got it down.
And I think that the other possible knock on this game is that sometimes the matches can feel a little bit too quick, where I only get to add kind of 4 or 5 or maybe 6 cards into the deck, and then already we're at the point where either I've already lost or it's just about over. And I guess the game being too quick, if that's like my biggest complaint, then that says something good about the game, but it is something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I do wish it lasted a little bit longer. And I think one of the interesting things, though, is just being able to try and find those combinations between those characters, because they all do play very differently. They all do interact with their partners. And as a result, it is going to feel like a very different game depending on which two characters you have and what your combination is.
And I think the folks who are going to like this game are probably anyone who, likes a head-to-head battler and who isn't worried about having just a little bit of rules overhead for each game that you play, because you are going to have to learn those couple of characters. And for people who like to mix and match and kind of experiment with a whole bunch of different play styles. And that is it. Have you played Tag Team? What did you think? And what other head-to-head card games would you recommend?
Thank you so much for watching, and as usual, please like, subscribe, and hopefully we'll see you next time for another game.